Please.
I'm Eugene Eteris, the Baltic Course magazine, international editor. Our magazine is situated, headquarters are in Riga, but Scandinavian office is here in Denmark. I'm not commenting on what was happening yesterday because...
A little bit closer to the mouth, please.
There were a lot of things yesterday said, and...
even closer if you can, sorry.
Yeah. What is important to my mind is that we have to give an answer to the first word there in our title of the conference, strategies. Where are we heading with all the things about culture and diplomacy? Strange mixture. We have cultural ministries in our countries, in all around our region, and we have diplomatic corps, which is foreign offices. They have different budgets. You can guess which is more. And they have a different importance, both for the ranks of the ministries and for the abilities to enforce what is happening on. What is happening on is three notions of what we are here: Nordic, Scandinavian, and Baltic Sea region. There are different countries here, and unfortunately we have had only Latvian Institute. Karen was brave, and we should praise her intentions to dwell on what is influence of Latvian Cultural Institute. Unfortunately, no Lithuanians, no Estonians. That's important, because we are so different in the three countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that we cannot cope. Three other countries, examples, for example, in Benelux, they could easily make it. They could make a union before they joined the union, the customs union, etc. The only thing that makes us together is Hansa Union. That was from the old days, and now we have it as a cultural heritage, which is good. If you go around the Baltic Sea in most of the cities, you would see that they are mostly alike in architecture. That's good, because this is how culture enforces through economic development. So behind all these things is economy. Of course, Nordic example is very good, because it's a driving force for all European things and everything. But don't exaggerate Nordic values. Look at the article number 2 in the Lisbon Treaty, which is a guiding instrument, basic law, uniting all 28 countries. It's started with the union is based on European values. Do we have something different here of our Nordic values? I doubt it. I remind you again, well, plenty of things were said about Nordic countries, how beautiful they are and how wonderful is it to live in the Nordic countries. But is it just these 5 countries? This is why we have it in the Baltic Sea area. This is why we have a new dimension here, Baltic Development Forum, because this is what unites us more, countries around the Baltic Sea. This is why the Union agreed on sub-regional development. This sub-regional development around Baltic Sea is much, well, it's a sign of what is happening in Europe. Look, there is another sub-regional development things along Danube. In the Black Sea, Mediterranean, are we splitting European values into different subcategories, into different cultures? Then another thing is that I'm referring to another example of Scandinavian pluses. Per Newholm book, Danish, by the way, journalist, which was called Europeans. Are we really building European culture? Or we are going to build, oh, okay, how much of all of us are Europeans? And how much of all of us are Latvians, Danes, Norwegians, Estonians? What is going to happen? That gives us another question. Are the national states going to disappear? or we are going to have something that would unite us in this is why we are building Europe. Europe from 6 to 28%. Of course, there are plenty of things in economics, in defense, especially now with this idiotic conflict, which could be predicted, by the way, if we were clever enough. But mind you that we are so different in the Baltic countries. Still, Nordic cannot accept the Baltic states as, okay, they are closer partners. We are still 5+3. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's not be bewildered by the idea of culture and diplomacy. There are two different things. They are working in the, well, they are not separate, of course. This is why, please, let's be a little bit more than just blah, blah, blah after the conference. So when we are asked, what did you get after the conference? Oh, boring, blah, blah, blah. No, we have to get something in our strategy. Either we are branding the Nordic model into the, at least into Europe or into the world, and making it a focal point. Let's all of us have the same system as it. I don't think so. And this is why it's good that we are different. And this is why it's good for culture to be the dominant thing here, not the diplomacy. The culture, this is good that we are different. Different Latvians art from that of Lithuanians, and of course that from Danish. That's important. This is the most wonderful thing. Let's get together and see how different we are. And probably out of this, sparking makes something wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I understand you correctly, the idea of a strategy would be possible, but emphasizing culture rather than diplomacy. Let's hear one more comment from the floor before I invite the panelists to respond.
Thank you very much for your introductions. My remark
and sorry, question, before you say your remark, maybe we know who you are.
Yeah, my name is Dimitrov, and I'm a master's student at London School of Economics and Political Science. Mm-hmm. My remark and question is directed to Mr. Norrman. Sweden has a really good record for countries now being a champion for human rights. A specific example that comes to my mind is for example, the Kurdish question and the rights of the Kurdish minority in Turkey. I remember many years ago, Anna Lindh, while she was still alive, was very active on the issue. And in your expose, you were mentioning the large Muslim minority in your country, and you were referring to strategies, how to win the hearts and minds of those people. Unfortunately, as the way I see the developments now, there is a growing trend for Muslim population across Europe, not just in Sweden, in the UK, in France, to actually be joining the other side, the enemy of our civilization, the way you refer to the Islamic State. And unfortunately, this is not happening in a vacuum. One of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, for this to be going on is the fact that the US and its flawed policy in the region has contributed to that and has disaffected a lot of people. So Sweden, being a champion for human rights, and you willing to win the hearts and minds of the large Muslim minorities in your country, would you agree with me that it might be a good idea to be a bit more critical on US controversial policy, for example, the drone campaign, the ongoing drone campaign, which has been criticized, deeply criticized by a lot of rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Report. This is the first question. And second one, very short one. Do you personally believe and support potential Swedish membership in NATO in the face of the ongoing crisis now in Ukraine? Thank you.
Right, now, Karl-Erik, how about that? There were some very specific questions there, some rather more broadly ones to begin with. Let's hear Karl-Erik's comments first, and then I invite other panelists. Please.
Thank you for the question. I completely agree with your analysis. It is a very serious fact that young Muslim boys mainly are recruited to the extremists in the Middle East. I think it is a very terrible fact. And it is, of course, you know, 20-year-old boys usually in history became soldiers, unfortunately. There's a lot of adrenaline and testosterone around for 20-year boys. And if they are unemployed and don't see any future, and if there are some strong bad guys in the shape of an imam tempting them to come and join where the party is going on, where there's some fighting and there's a meaning of life and even a meaning of death, well, they will join. So that is a terrible challenge for the whole European society, I feel. Perhaps the most terrible challenge we have. You heard from my statement that I am extremely critical against US policy in Iraq. They destroyed so much. They even succeeded in splitting up European Union in two camps, the so-called willing and the so-called non-willing. So the traces from that are really terrible. I think the drones is another very tricky problem. I'm a big fan of the series Homeland. I'm sure many of you have seen that. And it's a rather good way of problematizing the drone policy in the Middle East. So I'm critical, yes. I don't represent the Swedish government, by the way. I have left officially, so I speak for myself here. And in that capacity, I also say fully, 100% against NATO membership. Thank you.
I think we can safely say that was a clear response. Thank you very much. Bertel, Haarder, would you like to respond to some of the notions brought up, and also, if you will, to some of the suggestions that Halldór Ásgrímsson mentioned in his proposition, for instance, extending Nordic cultural cooperation from Baltic states to also Ukraine and Georgia, and some of the other propositions brought forward. Bertel, Haarder, please.
Yes, I'll be happy to. First, one remark about NATO. Just a footnote.
We're famous for those, aren't we?
Yes. The fact is that the Finnish president, the Finnish prime minister, and the Finnish minister for defense, they all admit that they are in favor of NATO membership. Just a little footnote. They are not, well, they are not raising the issue, but I think they are kind of reliable people to ask when you want to know what is good for Finland. So NATO cannot be that bad looking from a Finnish point of view. And your own leader of the Swedish defense, he said that Swedish defense can hold Sweden for 1 week, and everybody knows that after that it'll be NATO who will have to save your independence or to prevent that anyone is attacking you. That was just a footnote. Now, the curator of the Nordic Cool in Washington, she said something remarkable about Nordic culture. She said, through the years where they were preparing this Nordic Cool, she had been watching and looking for differences between the Nordic countries when it comes to culture. And her conclusion was that there are none. She simply couldn't see any differences between the Nordics when it comes to culture. And I think that is how we look from the outside. Mm-hmm. And we should use that a lot more. You quoted me as if I thought we were hypnotized by our differences. No, that was what the Serbian deputy president said, that the Balkan countries are hypnotized by their differences, and she admired us.
No, that's what, but by implication, perhaps there is something to think about as well for us.
Yeah, okay. At least we should exploit and cultivate and our similarities and use that as cultural stepping stones. And in fact, the Stoltenberg report, Stoltenberg is a former Norwegian foreign minister. He gave the Nordic Council of Ministers a report, I think 13 points. And one of them was about embassy cooperation. he proposed that we not only have a common wall surrounding our embassies as we have in Berlin. He wanted us to have more than this wall. He wanted us really to cooperate inside that wall, which I'm not sure we are doing so much in Berlin. And in fact, we have now common embassies in Myanmar. I think we are going to have it in Pakistan and maybe in Vietnam, and in Reykjavik. So it's developing, but then when Stoltenberg was here in this room a couple of months ago, he said that he was disappointed that this point had not been developed further. And he said, because he was asked, that he saw no problem in one ambassador from one Nordic country in many fields also to represent the other countries. What's the problem, he said. Of course we can do that. And I know Danish ambassadors who have the same opinion. But it is not happening. Particularly within the cultural field, there's a lot of reason why we could cooperate. And I really think we should. Also when it comes to fashion and food and all those other things that interest so many people, why don't we have a common action in London and New York and other places? So there's a lot to do in that area. Thank you.
Sorry, Bertel, if I may just hold on to you for a little while. Do we need a strategy for that, as Halldór Ásgrímsson was suggesting? And do you agree with his proposition to extend from the immediate neighbors in the Baltic Sea region to, say, Ukraine and Georgia? Would you agree with that proposition? To reach out further, as it were?
Well, if we disagree on Ukraine or Georgia, then of course we cannot cooperate. But we are practical people. So in all areas where we can agree, and there are lots of areas where we can agree, there we can cooperate. I mean, that's the Nordic way. And when it comes to the Arctic area, there was a beautiful article in The Economist describing all the potential conflicts in the Arctic and in the North Atlantic. And then the conclusion was that, and I quote, "Thanks to the relaxed Scandinavians, it will probably be solved peacefully altogether." That was a beautiful conclusion. Thanks to the relaxed Scandinavians. To be relaxed is to be pragmatic, to cooperate when we're able, I mean, when we agree. You had another question also.
The other notion was the idea of a strategy for cultural cooperation that Halldór Ásgrímsson brought up earlier.
I think it's very strange that we have lots of councils of ministers where the Nordic countries, where the ministers meet and have a policy. But we have no council for defense and foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And the Nordic Council, which is the parliamentarians' organ, we have no committee for defense and foreign policy. And I think that is very strange, because if we had a council and if we had a committee, I'm sure the parliamentarians would ask for strategies within some of the soft areas. But because we don't have this committee and because there's no council, then we only have the big meetings where the prime ministers are there for a couple of hours, and of course we can ask them questions, but it doesn't create something with a lot of perspective. But maybe my good friend Halldór Ásgrímsson should address this issue, because I think he both agrees and disagrees. And he knows more about it than I do.
Let's find out immediately.
He's former Secretary General of the whole thing.
He is indeed. Halldór, tell us a little bit more about what would come out of a strategy for cultural cooperation from your point of view.
We would know where we are heading, and we would know how to use cultural diplomacy and how we can utilize this to together. And I think that policy is needed. And I think it is also needed to formalize that. We have the cultural ministers, but it is very clear that the ministries of foreign affairs are working together with all the other ministries. But we have to, in my view, after my experience in the Nordic cooperation, we have to formalize this in some way. Because there is a need, for example, in the Nordic Council of Ministers, a lot of work is on neighboring policy. There is no connection between the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. Although the Nordic Council of Ministers is working on Russia, it's working on the Baltic countries, it's working on Arctic policy and so on. So I think some limited formal is needed here, and that's why I raised this. And it is also needed to form a policy, and it is difficult to form a policy if you don't have connections with those who are working on that policy. So that's what I'm trying to say, but I am aware of that the ministers of foreign affairs are against this, the prime ministers are against this, but I think they should consider this a little bit better, and maybe they could find a compromise. And therefore I mentioned that compromise could be a limited formalization of foreign policy, not the whole area.
Thank you for clarifying. Quick response? You need to put on the microphone.
I totally agree.
That I think lived up to my criteria of a short remark. Thank you very much. I'd like, if with your kind indulgence, to bring in Arne Grove at this stage, who's someone who has vast experience from Kaliningrad in Russia, where he was posted for a number of years. Your reaction to the proposition we heard from Halldór Ásgrímsson earlier on to extend cultural cooperation from the Baltic Sea rim and Kaliningrad further into Ukraine and to Georgia. How does this proposition sound to your ears, to your Russian experienced ears?
Thank you for the organizers for the seminar here and also for the presentations, both the last one from this morning and from yesterday. I think we should be aware that the situation, the relationship we have with Russia has changed dramatically over the last year. So we have what I call a strategic inflection point. It will not be business as usual afterwards. I remember when I started in Kaliningrad 19 years ago, people said, you can compare it to the Baltic states. That's not the situation, and it's still not the situation. In Kaliningrad, experience, it's a part of the Russian Federation, it's Russian culture, it's Russian legislation. I think it's important to continue the cooperation with Russia, with Russian partners, especially this cultural cooperation, people-to-people cooperation. But it's also important to develop the cooperation with partners from Ukraine. Even it's more complicated because Ukraine is not, for example, what Kaliningrad was 19 years ago, because they have more problems with after the war especially, and also they have problems with the corruptions which are quite serious, and the society is not working as well. So there's a lot of potential, but I think it's important with this people-to-people cooperation with Ukraine. And I will say I have a lot of personal contact in Kaliningrad, but also via this cooperation in Ukraine, and can see what happened and how they are, in fact, wanting to cooperate, to continue to develop cooperation.
So in conclusion, yes,
Yeah.
Halldór Ásgrímsson's idea is a good one, and it should focus on people-to-people contacts involving artists, stakeholders, as we heard in the previous session.
Yeah, but also I think it's important here not to build silos. It's important also to involve where it's possible business culture.
Business culture meaning enterprises that operate in the cultural sphere, right?
Yeah. Not when we're talking business, we are focused on talking about sanctions, but there's also another aspect. There will be a business, and here we should talk to business about dealing with corruption, to be tough on this issue.
Thank you very much. Comments, questions? We have one from the back of the room. Again, if you'd like to identify yourself, then we hear your comment.
Hello, does it work? Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anika Zlateva. I'm currently studying political science in Bulgaria, and I'll be very succinct. First, I would like to express my sincere admiration for the superb video we saw by the Latvian Institute to Miss Karina Peterson and her colleagues. And second, just a question, please correct me if I'm wrong.
You need to speak directly into the microphone, very close, please. Your question was, did we skip a video?
I might be wrong.
Okay.
I think we might have skipped a video right after the one.
Is the microphone not working now? All right, so the question is, did we skip a video?
I'm asking if...
Oh, I see. Well, you know, not my response. Mark, any idea? Did we skip a video, is the question?
Did we skip a video?
Well, you know, I'm not sure. Which video more specifically are you referring to? A video by the Baltic Development Forum. Fleming? Did we skip a video by Baltic Development Forum? The participant wants to know. Sorry? We can take it later. If time allows, we'll watch the film at the very end. One more question. I'm afraid this is having a slightly bad battery day, but I think if you stand up and speak up, then and in the meantime, let me just fix the batteries. So speak as loud. This one is not working, so speak as loud as you can.
To all three of you. Well, I'm a little bit worried that we, at the end of this show, moves into an era where we kind of end up polishing our Nordic halo, and then basically don't do much more, and then end up in the really tough issues, lean back, take a free ride with NATO. And so, I mean, that wasn't really the purpose of all this, I think. And then I would love to disagree a little bit, Bertel, with your using the Nordic cool in the US as an example of how identical we actually are in the Nordic-Baltic world. I would not, having lived many years in the US, necessarily take an American evaluation from a market point of view in an industry where business counts, like in the US cultural industry. That's business. And their evaluation of what kinds of differences there are in our culture, they wouldn't give a shit. They see us as something that can be sold under some fantastic brand that they can develop. And what do? We suddenly end up believing in a brand that they developed. I don't see a track record of genuine US cultural feeling of differences between cultures from the political point of view. I have a very good friend who was one of the first top officials during the occupation in Iraq. He wasn't there for a very long time. He was a very good Arabist and a very good friend. He was fired. He was fired because he told the Americans very early, when we now go into this occupation, we have to be aware that these people have a very different culture. We have to behave smart and with soft diplomacy, living with the cultural diversity that these people reflect. And the commanding officer, or whoever he was, the top #1 guy, you know, the guy with the desert boots, he told our colleague, "Shut up. I don't give a shit with these guys. They don't have a culture. We have one, and we're going to give them our culture." That's not the way to behave. That's why it's difficult to imagine that politicians should be kind of setting too much the direction for cultured people. I could illustrate it a little bit by, well, something that you would probably agree with, being a very liberal person. I usually say to people when they discuss these principles that the business of government is to stay out of business unless business needs government. You could use the same argument for culture.
Thank you. Now I'll give the panel a chance to respond in just a little while, but I want to take in one last contribution from the floor, after which we will have concluding remarks from our panel. Yeah. Bernd Henningsen, please.
Yeah, thank you, Werner. Bernd Henningsen. You know, I told you yesterday that I'm a bit critical regarding branding and branding of nations and regions, but nevertheless, I totally agree to what I heard these 2 days here, and I'm really delighted about to get to know facts and facts also regarding differences between these nations. What I would like to is to tell you some or to talk about some experiences I had the last, let me say, 10 to 20 years. I started at the beginning of the 90s establishing a Nordic Institute for Nordic Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin, and especially in Berlin, because I thought that one should communicate with the Nordic states and a wider region, including the Baltic Sea region, the Baltic states, and Poland, and to network together with the Scandinavians and to influence, let me say, German politicians in the Baltic Sea region. My experience is that regarding strategies for cooperation and good neighbor relations, we do have a firewall between us and them. A Finnish colleague of mine said some years ago, we do have in the Baltic Sea region, we do have 3 problems. And these are Russia, Poland, and Germany. Where are they? They don't engage, and that's what I would call the arrogance of the big ones in our region. And this attitude is answered by the impression one gets something of a closed shop of the Nordics. It's very difficult to get in as a foreigner. In the scientific community, in the political community, you have, in any case, you have to talk the languages of these countries. English is good, but it don't fit. We heard that already. And the most devastating, and it made me really depressing conversation I had with a person in charge inside the German Foreign Ministry, and he got the responsibility for the Nordic countries. And he asked me, why are you suggesting that we should deal with the Nordic countries? Why should we? A German official in the ministry. My simple answer was because we are neighbors. And I don't think that he grasped it. Things are well, we have good relations, so why shouldn't we? The old journalistic rule, only bad news or good news. That is not something which has to do with our region up here. There are no conflicts at all. There are no wars, no extremisms, and what have you. So that we could deal with them talking with these countries. And I think this is the attitude in Germany, in Poland, and in Russia, the big ones. We do have an organization. This is the Council of Baltic Sea States, where all are gathering. And this channel could be used. if, for example, well, let me say the German politicians, the German politics would have listened to politics, people, society in the Baltic states in 2008 during the Georgian conflict and the Georgian war. Maybe we would have understood the conflicts which are actual in the moment. We would have better understood what happens, listening to the experiences of, for example, the Baltic Sea states. So this is my personal experiences with our society and with our politics. I'm a bit depressed still, even though I see the good developments, but it could be better. One could do more.
Bernd Henningsen, thank you very much. I mean, despite your state of slight depression, your efforts as spokesperson on the German side is much appreciated. I will now hand you over to our panelists for responses to some of those issues that have been brought up, combined with final reflections as we're drawing towards a close. I'd like to start with you, Bertel Haarder, since the previous speaker addressed a few questions directly to you. So if you could respond to those and give us your final remarks before we move on to the next panelist, please.
I listened with great interest to Bernd Henningsen. I'm afraid he's right. And I want to underline that when I quoted Mrs. Alicia Adams, who was the curator for Nordic Cool in Washington, it was just in order to describe how someone with knowledge, looking at us from the outside, how she conceives the Nordic countries. I think that's interesting. I can see the differences, but those who stand outside the Nordic community, they may not be able to see the differences. In Belgrade, there is a beautiful Swedish cultural house. There's no Danish, and I don't think there's any Norwegian or Icelandic or Finnish either. I think it would make a very deep impression on the Serbians if there were a Nordic house there, if we cooperated and also in action proved that this is how nation states can cooperate when they present their culture and engage in dialogue. The Danish Minister for Culture is very engaged in that idea. She will work for it in the Nordic Council, and I hope something will come out of it. So my idea is not that we should now coordinate everything we are doing in the cultural area in the Nordic countries. No, we should again be pragmatic and cooperate where there is a Nordic added value in cooperation. For instance, in Korea and in Japan, Denmark has a name. There is no reason to change things, what is Danish in Korea, to turn that into something Nordic, because they know Denmark very well for many reasons. Whereas in the Anglo-Saxon countries, I think the Nordic brand is stronger than the Danish brand. Therefore, I would like us to use the Nordic model in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Let us be pragmatic and let us work where it's possible, work together where it's possible and where there's added value. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertel Haarder. Halldór, Ásgrímsson, you've had a few positive, I could add, responses to some of your propositions from the floor this late morning, but you've also been part of our conference for the whole of today and yesterday. So let us hear, as your final reflections, what you take with you as the most important points from our 2 days of conference here.
I think it's very clear after listening to these 2 days that we need stronger cooperation in certain areas. And when I'm talking about new policy, I'm not talking about detailed policy. I'm talking about to agree on what are we going to cooperate on. And that is very important that we know that. When we are cooperating, for example, with Russia, we have a policy on that. But that is not made up only in the Nordic countries, it is also made up in Russia. We would not issue a policy on cooperation with Russia without the Russians reading it over and coming with their proposals. And that is the same for the Baltic countries. And if we would start cooperation, formal cooperation with Ukraine, then we had to know what do they want. We are not coming to Ukraine just to tell them how wonderful we are, because we are not always wonderful.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. So this is what I'm talking about, that we need such a policy. I'm not talking about a policy on telling the cultural people what to do. Are they going to play chess or whatever they are going to do? It's up to them, of course. But there has to be a certain infrastructure. And the countries will continue to work individually. That is very clear. But it is very clear to me, in many cases, there is much added value to be found in more cooperation. And it is not only added value; it is also to save money. A lot of money can be saved by closer cooperation. So it is not right that it is going to be very expensive. On the other hand, it is going to save money. So I'm going from here more convinced on stronger Nordic cooperation. I have always been a big believer in Nordic cooperation, and I have actually also been a big believer in NATO. That is another thing, but I have been a very strong believer in Nordic cooperation, and that is not less after I leave this symposium.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Halldór Ásgrímsson. Karl-Erik, Norrman, we've also had the pleasure of your company throughout our conference. Let's hear what you take with you as the most important points that I hope has made your participation worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Well, it's wonderful revisiting the Nordic idea, which Copenhagen symbolizes so well. Here is the Nordic Council of Ministers, etc., and this is very much their heart. I know that the Swedes, when you arrive at Arlanda, they are boosting, here's the capital of Scandinavia. But I think this is more a PR gimmick than perhaps the truth. Anyway, so we are really here discussing Nordic, and that feels good. If you are very, very far away in the world, somewhere in South Africa or South America or Southeast Asia, you tend to see Europe as one unit. Europe is over there, is that little corner of the huge Asian continent, isn't it? But it always was a very important little corner. And one further little corner of that little corner is the Nordic states. And if you see, talking about the outside perspective, the further you are away, the closer it is and the more difficult it is to see the differences. Now we are digging down a little bit here these days, and we discover differences and we discover similarities and so on. But I think for me it's quite clear, it's a confirmation that the Nordic countries, including the Baltic countries, are good. And being good means also that we have a good chance all over the world to have a lot of credibility for whatever initiative we wish to take. And this credibility gives us the responsibility to take initiatives wherever we can and to coordinate our resources and strategy and so on to this extent. For instance, for a reasonable dialogue with both Russia, Ukraine, and the other Soviet states in crisis, for a fight against religious extremism wherever it occurs, for a fight against the new nationalistic tendencies in Europe, and last but not least, for saving the planet. Thank you.
I thought that was a very apt ending as a reflection for saving the planet. Well done, Karl-Erik. The end is nigh, and I would like, for my part, to thank you all very much. I've enjoyed our discussions. I'd like to thank you for your active participation throughout.